Okay, well, good morning and welcome to Hebrews Story Hour. Today we're reading Genesis 29, perhaps some of 30, although we're going to read 1 through 30 and then stop and have some conversation. And then we will see if we have time for reading on. So we have Jacob going to Haran today. Okay, so the Lord bless the reading of his word, Genesis 29:1. Vayasa Yaakov raglav, vayelech artsa v'nei kedem. Vayar, v'hine be'er basadeh, v'hine sham shalosha edrei tzon rovetzim aleha ki min haba'er hahi. Yashku ha-adarim v'ha-even gedolah al pi ha-be'er. Verse 3, v'ne'esfu shama kol ha-adarim v'galelu et ha-even me'al pi ha-be'er. V'hishku et hatzon V'heshivu et ha'evan al pi habe'er limkoma. Okay, so translating the beginning here. And Jacob lifted up his feet and he went to the land of the sons of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field. And look, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying down around it. For from the well, or from that well, they would water the flocks. And the stone, a great stone, was upon the surface of the well. And then verse 3, and they would gather there all of the flocks, and they would remove or roll away the stone from upon the surface of the well, and they would water the flock. And then they would return the stone on the surface, or the mouth of the well, to its place. Verse 4, Vayomer lahem Yaakov, Achai me ayin atem, vayomeru me Haran anachnu, vayomer lahem ha yidatem et Lavan ben Nachor, vayomeru yadanu, vayomer lahem hashalom lo, vayomeru shalom, vahine Rachel Bito ba'a im hatzon. Verse 7, Vayomer hein od hayom gadol, lo et he asef hamikneh, hashku hatzon, ulechu re'u. Vayomeru lo nuchal ad asher Ye'asafu kol ha'adarim v'galelu et ha'evan me'al pi habe'er v'hishkinu hatzon. Translating verse 4. And Jacob said to them, my brothers, where are you from? And they said, from Haran, or we're from Haran. And he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nachor? And they said, we know him. And he said to them, is it well with him? And they said, it's well. And look, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. And he said, look, it's still broad daylight, or high noon, or still lots of light, lots of day left. So time, not, is it not, I think there's a question. Is it not time for gathering the livestock? Water the sheep and go and then shepherd or graze. And they said, we're not able until all of the flocks will be gathered, and then they will roll away the stone from upon the mouth of the well, the surface of the well, and then we will water the sheep. Okay, verse 9. Odenu midaber imam v'Rachel ba'a im hatson asher la'aviha ki ro'a hi. Vayehi ka'asher ra'a Yaakov et Rachel bat Lavan achi imo ve'et son Lavan achi imo. Vayigash Yaakov vayagol et ha'evan me'al pi haba'er vayashk et son Lavan achi imo. Verse 11. Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel, vayisa et kolo vayevik. Verse 12. Vayaged Yaakov l'Rachel ki achi aviha hu, v'chi ven Rivka hu, vayarotz v'tarotz v'taged la'aviha. Translating verse 9. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with the sheep, which belonged to her father, for she was a shepherdess. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Lavan, the brother of his mother, and the sheep of Laban, the brother of his mother, Jacob drew near, and he removed the stone, or he rolled away the stone from upon the surface of the well, and he watered the sheep of Laban, the brother of his mother. Verse 11, and Jacob kissed Rachel, and he lifted his voice, and he wept. And Jacob drew near to Rachel. And Jacob told Rachel that the brother of his father was he. So he was a brother of his father, and that he was the son of Rebekah. And she ran and she told her father. Okay, verse 13. Vayehi kishmoa Lavan et shema Yaakov ben achoto, vayarotz likrato, vayechabek lo, vayenashek lo, vayeviehu el beito, vayesaper lelavan et kol hadvarim ha'ele. Verse 14. Vayomer lo Lavan ach atzmi uvesari ata. Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. Verse 15. Vayomer Lavan la Yaakov hachi ata va'avadtani chinam hagidali ma maskuratecha. Okay, short section, verse 13. And when Laban heard the report of Jacob, son of his sister, he ran to meet him, and he embraced him, and he kissed him, and he brought him into his house. And he, that's Jacob, reported to Laban all of these things. And he said to him, or Laban said to him, Surely my bone and my flesh are you. And he stayed with him. That's a month of days, about a month span of time. And Laban said to Jacob, is it that you are my brother and that you will serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wage should be, or tell me your wage. In verse 16, Ulalavan shete vanot shem hagidola Leah, v'shem hakitana Rachel, v'enei Leah rakot, v'Rachel hayata yefat toar, v'fat mar'eh. Verse 18, v'ye'ahav Yaakov et Rachel, v'yomer e'evodcha sheva shanim v'Rachel bittecha haketana. V'yomer Lavan tov titi ota lach bititi ota leish acher sheva imadi. V'ya'avor Yaakov v'Rachel sheva shanim v'yihu v'einav kiyamim achadim v'ahavato ota. Okay, verse 16. Now, Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And the eyes of Leah were tender or maybe weak, but Rachel had a beautiful form and was a sight to see, or a beautiful vision. And Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, I will work for you, I will serve you 7 years in exchange for Rachel, your youngest daughter. And Laban said, it's better for me to give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me. And Jacob served in exchange for Rachel 7 years. And they were in his eyes like a few days, or maybe even single day, because on account of his love for her. Verse 21, Vayomer Yaakov el Lavan, Hava et ishti ki malu yamai, va'avoa eleha, v'yesof Lavan et kol anshe hamakom v'ya'as mishteh. Verse 23, Vayehi va'erev vayikach et Leah vito vayave ota elav vayavo eleha. Vayetain Lavan la et Zilpa shifchato leleah vito shifcha. Verse 25, Vayehi vavoker vahine Leah vayomer el Lavan mazot asitali halo varachel avadti imak valama rimitani. Verse 26, vayomer Lavan lo yeaseh chen bim komenu latet hatziira lifnei habechira male shivua zot v'nitna lecha gam et zot ba'avoda asher ta'vor imadi od sheva shanim Acherot. Verse 28. Vaya'as Yaakov chen, vayimale shavua zot, vayitin lo et Rachel bito, lo leisha. Vayitain lava lerachel bito et bilcha shivchato la leshivcha. Verse 30. Vayavo gam el Rachel, vayehav gam et Rachel mileah. Vayavod imo od sheva shanim acherot. Okay, going back now to translate in 21. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for the days have been fulfilled, and I will enter into her. And Laban gathered all the men of the place, and he prepared a feast. And it was and it came about in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and he brought her to him, and he entered into her. Laban gave to her Zilpah, his maidservant, to Leah, his daughter, as a maidservant. And in the morning, look, it was Leah, or there was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Is it not in exchange for Rachel that I served you, or I served with you? Why have you betrayed me? And Laban said, this is not done in our place, to give the younger before the older, the firstborn. Fulfill the week of this one, then let us give to you also this one or that one in exchange for your work, which you will do with me until 7 years, or for another 7 years. And Jacob did thus, and Jacob did so, and he filled the week, or fulfilled the week of this one, and he gave to him Rachel, his daughter, as a wife. And Laban gave Rachel, his daughter, Bilhah, his maidservant, as a maidservant for her. And he entered also into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with him another 7 years. I think that, although it's not the end of the chapter, that's the end of this part of the story. All right, so I imagine this plenty to talk about. I was telling somebody that I was reading Genesis 29 with Hebrew Story Hour today, and it's sort of like, what do you take away from this? I think there are some takeaways, but very human story. What questions or observations do you have?
Well, one of them that sort of caught my attention was in verse 13. It says that Laban ran to go meet Joseph. And that sort of struck me as interesting, just because I feel like I've heard something about, like in Hebrew culture, it was kind of shameful for a man to run. I may or may not be right about that. And so there's a point that was drawn specifically with the prodigal son. The father ran. It was it was kind of drawn through there. So I didn't know how much that really would apply to this, but it just stood out that he didn't just go see him. He ran to go find the guy. And that applies some level of urgency and so forth. Yeah. And I wondered if there was any comment on that anybody had.
I'll start by just saying that I'm not sure about the argument for the shame involved with running. But we do have other parallel stories that I think, stories of hospitality, thinking back on like Genesis 18, when Abraham was hurrying everywhere to show hospitality. And there's probably the closest parallel to this is when Abraham's servant came to find a wife for Rebecca. And I think those two stories have a lot in common. And then you kind of have, in that story, Rebecca running, I think she runs back, and here you have Rachel running back. And then, Laban then coming out in that story as well. And I forget if he ran in that story, but there's definitely a kind of comparison. Maybe there's other reflections or comments. Scott?
My question was more along the lines of Jacob's response to Jacob's response to Rachel when he sees her and he kisses her, and then kind of paralleling with Rebecca or Isaac's response to seeing Rebecca for the first time. Is it, I guess I don't know. My perception of ancient marriage was not like that it was entirely, not that it was devoid of emotion, but it was more of a partnership that developed maybe later into a love affair, but that it wasn't maybe a initial like a motive. We tend to make a lot of the Isaac and Rebecca story probably because it fits our own concept of marriage more so than an ancient one. But what do you make of that? Do you think anything of this? Is this unusual to have these two like very emotional responses to the wife meeting her for the first time?
Yeah, I'll chime in, but go ahead. I'll throw that one out. Dusty?
So just last week, I was teaching a class on wedding feasts and Jewish marriage customs and so forth. So I've just been thinking on these things. And based on my research, I think, Scott, you're exactly right that most of the time it was more of a covenant relationship bound between almost a decision between two fathers that our children should wed, and that it would be a beneficial relationship for both families involved. And it was more about that covenant than it was any sort of romance. And I think you can still see a little bit of that element in this story, because they sent Jacob, go back to our people and find a wife, so that whenever those two families were joined together, that they're still our people. And so I think there's an element of that there. But this story was specifically one that's kind of pointed out as unusual, as well as Isaac's marriage to Rebecca. I always get them switched.
Yeah.
Because they ask her, will you go with him? Like, that's an unusual thing.
Right.
And this is another unusual event as well that I think is interesting, but it isn't considered to be the norm. That it was more of an attraction in the marriage instead of the covenant. Two guys maybe chose whenever their son and daughter were small children, they're going to get married whenever they get older. It was like, this is different. And I've always found that kind of interesting as well. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. I could be wrong, but that's what I think.
No, there's a contractual nature to marriage. Even a lot of these, even in this story, like if we think about the Rebecca and Isaac arrangement, they paid a large bride price for Rebecca, like all of the ornaments and things in that story and as a way of demonstrating. Of course, in that story, like the Lord is leading and providentially kind of Rebecca showing up and all that, but there's kind of money there's in an exchange. Whereas in this story, Jacob doesn't have anything to give except his time, but there's still an exchange, this agreement that's worked out. The kiss thing is funny. One time I saw, there's a movie called Jacob, and it makes for, like, you can imagine this would make for a good drama, a good movie. It's a really terrible movie, like a lot of these reenactments. And this story, I love the scene where like Jacob first lays eyes on Rachel, and it's like the music is playing in the background, and then they kiss romantically. It's just like this big, like instant love, And I can get how you'd see that, but if you keep reading in the story, Laban and Jacob also kiss. So like it's a kind of it's a custom, right, for family. It's a sign of hey, we're brothers, we're family, or so. But there is this repetition of Jacob loved Rachel, and there's a flip side of that too, that he didn't love Leah. But there's this kind of repetition of like his instant attraction that, I mean, even in arranged marriages could happen, but it's playing with conventions or telling the story within the conventions of marriage. Maybe there's other reflections or questions, kind of both of those first two questions on marriage.
Lance, I think one of the biggest mysteries of this text is how could Jacob not know he was with Leah?
Yeah. Is okay. So I've taken that as a question. It is a mystery.
That's the question. How could he
Yeah.
not know who he was with? I mean,
Yeah.
no matter in the pitch dark, you should know.
Right. Yeah, I would say there's the only narrative clue to that is, well, I think there's a couple of narrative clues. So just looking within the story, it does tell us that it's evening, so it's dark outside, and those types of bits and pieces of narrative information are in the Hebrew Bible are sort of sparse. So when they appear there, we probably ought to pay attention to them. There's also a big feast that's been happening, and evidently, so there's a kind of almost poetic use of bow here, where I forget what verse this is, but where Laban brings her in, and bow is a Hifil, and then the kind of the euphemistic use of bow for sex here, and then Jacob bows Leah. But I mean, so I think it's dark outside. They've been drinking a lot, perhaps part of this partying atmosphere. I mean, and not we associate perhaps that negatively, but it's not in this story. The Mishta. The other explanation I've heard is that perhaps she's veiled. And so, I mean, eventually she's not veiled, I suppose, but all these factors might contribute to, obviously, he doesn't know until the morning time, until the sun shines again, that he's been duped.
I've always wondered too, because wouldn't you be able to recognize each other's voice, And so I think you may be onto something that the wedding feast, the good wine, if you will, is served first, and when everybody's drunk freely, then the cheap, as we learn about in John, right?
Yeah.
So you can't help but wonder that their customs. This is funny because I'm teaching this class. I'm also researching about wine, and they were like, it was frowned upon. Drunkenness was like strongly frowned upon in all Mediterranean cultures, and they said except the Hebrews during wedding feasts. Like there was something about wedding feasts where it was like sort of anything goes. Yeah. And I'm like, I think that you may be right. They may have drunk freely and celebrated extensively, and then so the senses are dulled. And it reminds me of Lot, right? He didn't know when his daughter lay down and when she got up. If there's a similar level of inebriation involved, then maybe it could be that he's so toasted that he's like, I don't know. But that's contrary to what we would do in our Protestant culture, I guess. But
But if you were Leah, wouldn't it behoove you to be quiet and not make any speech, maybe some sounds, but no words, so that he doesn't know? I mean, this is one of the cases where what comes around goes around for Jake.
Yeah, that's really brings out the parallel with the blessing scene where Jacob is coming in secret. Isaac recognizes it's Jacob's voice, but it's but also in that story, Rebecca, Laban's sister, is the one bringing Jacob in. But you're right, the voice, quality of the voice comes up there. But so there's a couple of parallels to these other stories in Jacob's life, where I think it's good to think about, like, well, if you're Leah, what are you thinking here? Following your dad's orders. I mean, I think we ought rightly to have, and God himself is sympathetic toward Leah in this story as we get going. But yeah, it's
Maybe one other factor in this,
Mhm.
when it says Leah's eyes were weak,
Yeah,
that does not mean that they were ugly. It may mean that it was myopic, that she couldn't see well. And
yeah.
otherwise, the girls might have looked very similar, except that Rachel, I mean, they were sisters, right?
Mhm.
But it says Rachel was beautiful of form. So it could be that Leah is either really, really skinny or really, really fat or flat chested or something, all of which would have been hidden by the clothes. So
Yeah,
what
it's
the difference is there? It might not have been easy to tell in the dark and inebriated.
yeah. The word there, rock coat, is difficult. It usually does. It can mean like tender or gentle. That's always a positive way. Here, the contrast is with, I think, basically generally Jacob was attracted to the appearance of Rachel. I don't think it says anything else really about the appearance of Leah except her eyes. And so it could be that she couldn't see well. It could be so kind of weak in that sense. It could be that I mean, just like at the Westermann, I was looking at his translation of this. He said, I think he says basically they lack luster. Leah's eyes were without luster, which doesn't clear it up. But the point is, the story itself is kind of ambiguous about the eyes of Leah. And so you can kind of take this different ways, but either way, it's in contrast with Rachel and how basically Jacob was attracted to one and not the other. I saw a hand. Scott?
This may be anachronistic, but when you get to the New Testament, there's the references to eyes, having clear eyes, and it's a way of saying good character, bad eyes, bad character. Is there anything, would that have been something in this time period that was referenced about eyesight, having good eyes, like a person of good character, something winsome about them, maybe a personality trait that was attractive versus, we're talking physically.
Yeah.
But
right.
could it be also something referencing to characteristics of the person, traits of personality?
The world is always open up to metaphor. I don't think it's I don't see it in this story, although it might be like worth tracing in like Leah's story to see if there's references to how she sees kind of metaphorically. But because that is a common, like seeing and taking and all of these types of things. It's worth following down, but I don't think that's here, at least in this particular line. Be interesting to see how that plays out in Leah's character. This is the kind of thing where the rabbis, I bet they have a lot to say about this. So if you're a rabbinic guy or girl, you might have something to share on this or trace down. But when it's just, you hear like one little line and it's not very clear, it just opens itself up for all sorts of interpretation, creative interpretation.
Can I shift gears?
Sure.
Okay, I didn't want to. And if somebody else has a comment on the other, don't let me take it away. But I was thinking about, I think it's verses 7 and 8, whenever all the shepherds are gathering together and the flocks are coming and there's the stone.
Yeah.
it's definitely too much of a stretch to try to apply it to like the whole grave and resurrection. But it caught my ear for whatever reason. That like, who's going to roll the stone away for us? Basically, it was kind of the conversation. We all have to be here before we can roll it away. And I remembered the ladies coming to the tomb. Who's going to roll the stone away? Like somebody's going to have to do this for us.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not the same, and I'm not trying to make a parallel because I don't think that's appropriate. But it just struck my ear today when we were saying that, and it's just fascinating, this image of stone where it's like the guy who came and rolled the stone away was kind of a big deal. And
there's interesting kind of one line of thought. Some have even said that like Jacob is like this giant to be able to move the stone, but in this does seem to be, I don't think that, because this seems to be the one place where he shows almost kind of extra human strength, like super strength, to roll it away, because it seems like it takes multiple people usually, but he just goes up and does it. Kind of a show of his power and his strength, and not following, the way of the land out of urgency of helping Rachel. The other things that come up here is the well is the typological place for betrothal scenes. So anytime this, and Robert Alter talks about this in his book about the art of biblical narrative, where he talks about type scenes. And there are certain features of a genre or a type of scene where you kind of know what's going to happen. And he argues that wells always coordinate with betrothal scenes. We may have talked about this when we did the Isaac Rebecca betrothal scene, but we'll see this again. And we even see something similar in Moses's story, and shepherding comes up there. So there's different versions of these betrothal scenes for sure, but it's like where you go to meet somebody is the well. And the other thing, Dusty, your comment reminded me of is stones. We talked about this last week with Bethel and the stone that stood up, and just watching for stones in these Jacob stories. They play a significant kind of narrative part in Jacob stories. Good. Marisa?
I had noticed this point too, where they say, well, we can't do it. And he's like, I can do it, once he has the right impetus to do it. But this isn't the only place, talking about a show of his strength. You have that when he wrestles later on.
Yeah.
It's another show of his strength at that point. And this also goes, I think, to show that when he is able to take the stone away, and he does it as soon as Rachel appears, it is showing he is the better man. He's going to be the better provider. It puts him in a good light compared to the local guys.
Yeah.
That the girls might normally choose from for a spouse.
Yeah. And not just the local guys, but the local shepherds, where Jacob is going to be the shepherd extraordinaire. And then also Rachel is a shepherd. They're like this power shepherding couple. It's a good comparison with the wrestling story that's coming up, where Jacob seems to have this kind of unusual strength. Good. Yes.
You asked about the rabbis.
I knew you would come through.
I wasn't even, because I just heard the weak eyes, and I was just thinking it was a tie back to Isaac having Isaac's eyes. I wasn't even really poking at that. But you'll enjoy what's in here. Maybe you already have a hint. Leah's eyes were tender because she wept constantly in prayer that she would not have to marry Esau.
No.
People used to say that since Rebecca had 2 sons and Laban 2 daughters, the elder daughter would be married to the elder son, while the younger daughter was destined to marry the younger son.
There's a link that I didn't even think about.
this story seems like such a tie to the Deuteronomy 21. I'm not sure if you're going to touch on that about having two wives, loving one, but not the other. Both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love. And then when he wills the property to his sons, he must not give the rights of the firstborn to the wife of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves in preference to his actual firstborn, the son of the wife he does not love.
Yeah.
And here Jacob did precisely that for giving Jacob's sons, adopting them basically to give the double share.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I hadn't actually thought much about the connection there. These stories seem so unrelated in some ways to texts like, legal texts like the Torah texts that are coming up, but it's clearly that does relate to the kind of the customs at this point, which will become kind of legalized in Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 21.
I need a peek.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, it's fine.
Deuteronomy, yes, 21 verses 15 through 17.
That's good. Okay.
Did you say it was Rachel who cried all the time?
No, ma'am. The Leah.
Okay, because I found another rabbi who said Leah's eyes were soft, so that because her eyes were so beautiful, she appeared beautiful all over, as contrasted to Rachel, whose body was beautiful, but whose eyes detracted from her because she cried a lot, fearing that she would be married to Esau when Jacob divorced her for not having a child.
What's interesting, like the rabbis are having this besides the Rachel Leah thing, that there's this Esau connection. Like they're still needing to like put the pieces together with Esau, who obviously who hasn't married in the family, maybe like he was supposed to. So I can see how they're making this connection, where the expectation would have been Esau and Leah to be married.
So what I read cited Rashi. Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Who you cited?
Oh,
It's Dot Zakinin.
Okay.
DAATZKENIM.
there you go. Yeah, there's if y'all have never read like the Talmud or something where we have these rabbis, rabbi this says this, rabbi that. The point is not necessarily to give the once for all correct answer as much as the dialogue and often they pick up on the details that are the most ambiguous and make the most out of them. And so this is the kind of thing that would like stir up a lot of conversation among them. Sometimes we can learn something, like at least give us a new line of thought from their conversations.
You were talking about, and I know we didn't get to the list of the sons yet, but
Yeah.
isn't the firstborn Reuben?
Yes.
Yeah, so Reuben is the one that goes into either Zilha or Bilhah, right?
Bilhah.
Bilhah?
Yeah, the story of
And-
Mandrix.
Yeah, causes he sleeps with one of his father's wives, right? And it causes him to be a stench in his father's side, and he doesn't get good things to come. But the fourthborn, Judah, is the one that really gets all of the accolade. I know that they'll later say blessed as Ephraim and Manasseh, like they always point to Ephraim and Manasseh as the ones that are really blessed. But it's interesting that Judah is the one who really carries forward a lot of the blessing of the people. And of course, the Lion of Judah, and Judah, the nation that becomes, if you will, once the kingdoms divide, Judah is where really a lot of God's blessing is in the lineage to Christ. And it's interesting to me that it's not the firstborn, but the fourth.
Yeah, and then
that it would go that way.
Right. Yeah, there are stories so it's Reuben, Simeon, Levi, then Judah, all sons of Leah. And there are the rest of Genesis, and I misspoke. The story of the mandrakes is a Reuben story, but that's not the story where he sleeps with the Bilhah. But that is a story that explains, like, all of these characters, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, somehow kind of bring shame upon the family or do something that when they're blessed at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 49, as they go through all the Judah receives essentially the best blessing because he's sort of next in line for carrying out kind of almost the divine promise. Although that, yeah, you're right, Manasseh and Ephraim get these special blessings, and we have a narrative about that. But there's I do think a lot of those stories are told, at least, because of the prominence of Judah later in the life of Israel, and the importance of, Judah being the southern kingdom, one of the two who are in the south. And essentially what we have in the Bible is a story told from the southerners. We have some northerners, northern voices in this as well, but this kind of the southern kingdom tells the story in the end. Marisa?
Going off of what you were talking about with Judah and Reuben, I think it's interesting when you get to the Joseph going into the pit, going into captivity. The two brothers that are specified are Reuben and Judah. And Reuben doesn't want to, Reuben is planning to rescue him later, and Judah is the one that says, oh, let's sell him, not kill him.
Right.
And they're the only two that come up in the mention there.
Yeah, and I think that also coordinates with this point. And like Judah comes off better than the others in that story. That's
and when you look at the sort of the character arc, if you will, of Judah, whenever they are in Egypt and Joseph is trying to keep Benjamin, I feel like Judah's speech at that point has always been kind of beautiful to me, because he sort of comes hat in hand, so to speak, and he's like, look, I've messed up before, basically. And he's like, if I don't bring my brother back to my father, he's like, this is not going to be okay. And he really has this long speech to explain all of the ills that he has done unwittingly to his brother. And it's interesting to look at how Judah changed because of some of the experiences that he had been through, and essentially his maturity over the years. And I always enjoy just kind of looking at what would it be, like 24-ish years since Joseph was 17 till he was 30, and then 7 years of good.
Yeah.
And now we're in the famine. It's like a lot of time has gone by, and a lot of things have happened. And Judah is a different man today than he was then. And you don't really get to see that from much anybody else.
Yeah, now we're getting into the Joseph narrative, but
sorry.
that's a kind of a thing to itself. But Judah's character I'm thinking about like Judah and Tamar, also a veil, kind of deceit, and it's maybe related to even our story. Dan?
I was glad we got around to talking about Bilhah. There's something about Bilhah and Zilpah in the story. I don't think they're just being introduced as names because they're going to later be prominent as moms of tribes. But there's something about the fact that they were first servants to Laban and then given as servants to the daughters.
Yeah.
Can you fill in some color about what it meant to be a servant? What do we understand from these girls being servants to Laban before he gives them to his daughters?
That's a good question. I don't know that I'll be able to fill it out too much, and I think it's a good observation that they're kind of part of I take that to mean that they're part of the family in a servant role. I mean, Shifka, this maid servant role would have been, they're not married, and I don't think they have any kind of sexual relationship or anything like that with Laban. I essentially think they're girls growing up in the household, but we don't have any background on them beforehand, servants of some sort. But they play this in particular role in being then being transferred over to the service of the daughters. But we don't have, I don't know of this. Maybe somebody else can think of a story where you have a maidservant or a young servant serving the family, but not in kind of any kind of marriage or sexual relationship with somebody. So like the kind of the pre-life of what Bilhah and Zilpah would have been experiencing in Laban's household, except seemingly like born into it. Of course, from the time of Abraham, he has servants, like we hear about Eleazar, the one who might inherit Abraham's possessions if he doesn't have a son. So there are children sort of within his household that are not his blood. But it's a good observation, I think, that these are a gift ultimately from Laban to his daughters.
And presumably, if they're not married, but they're old enough to be on their own, we're looking at girls that are 12 years old-ish.
I would think they would be younger, maybe contemporaries with Rachel and Leah. It's hard to know how old. I mean, certainly marriageable age would have been probably younger than our own context or what's typical in our culture. But I don't necessarily picture as 12-year-old type of girls, but it could have been, I suppose. Yeah, Marisa?
This made me think about when we were talking about Rachel a couple of weeks ago. A servant went with her, and we were talking about the age she was. And so maybe, is there anything that speaks about tradition of the nursemaid that goes with them at the time of marriage, then to carry on that same function, but then for the next generation?
Thinking about Rebecca's nursemaid who goes back with her. Yeah, right. I mean, I think it's a sign of wealth, right? These are wealthy families, and to have a servant, basically, it's like, see, like royalty having these. But right, and we don't, we have these Bilhah and Zilpah end up being fuller characters because of the importance they have in the kind of the patriarchal story as a whole. But I would assume Sarah would have somebody like this who would work for her as well, and Rebecca, yeah. Yeah, I thought we might get into the rest, but then about 15 minutes ago, I thought, well, let's just have conversation. So when we return, we'll be really picking up on this Leah and Rachel becoming the main characters. They've been fairly passive in our story, right? I mean, this is really a struggle between Laban and Jacob, this betrayal or deceit and all of this. But the tide is going to turn in the next stories, and any kind of stories that involve barrenness or childbearing, then the men tend to be fairly passive, and Leah and Rachel become the main characters. There's one line that I'm really excited to talk about in the next story, and it's when she names Naphtali, Leah. It's about, or no, it's Rachel naming Naphtali. She says, wrestlings with my sister, as this word relates to wrestling. And so you have like another parallel between Rachel and Jacob, who will be kind of both wrestling with God, wrestling with their sister. And it's just kind of these relationships that when you read these stories closely, you can see all these kind of points of coordination, which I think then raises this bigger question of kind of like, what's the point? What's the takeaway? Yeah, it's really intriguing, the narrative, the deceit, and makes for a good drama. But what are we supposed to be seeing in here? And I think one of the takeaways for sure throughout most of these patriarchal narratives is just how God is working, maybe sometimes in spite of people, and even through the flaws, continuing to carry out the patriarchal promise, that God can make a promise, but the way that it plays out or is carried out is not always very predictable.
I appreciate all that you're sharing with us about the character of these people. That's the part of the story that fascinates me. What was there in Bilhah? Because we're going to see her later actions. What was there in Leah? What was in Jacob towards Leah?
Yeah.
Because he doesn't just say, no, you broke your covenant and walk away. He works another 7 years for Leah.
Right.
So between them there, and she ends up having a bunch of kids. He's not leaving her alone, you know?
Yeah.
There's something in that relationship and that character.
Right.
And yet she is the one that is described as the hated wife, unloved by her husband. You know, it's such a bitter thing that I always read these stories and I'm like, I feel so sorry for Leah, you know, because it literally says, now my husband will be attached to me, or somehow these sons that I'm bearing are gonna cause my husband to love me until Judah. And then she goes, okay, I've given up on that this time. I'm just gonna praise God. And it's like, man, even with all of the things that she's going through, I think, Dan, you make some really strong points with all of that. It's interesting.
These full narratives really give us a sense of feeling for the characters, and that's part of the beauty of the stories. Okay, well, that does it for our hour. Let me make an announcement, and if you're not a part of our Facebook group, if you're not on Facebook, God bless you. That's good for you. If you are on Facebook, join the Facebook group for announcements. Next week, actually the next 2 weeks, I have obligations, teaching obligations, family obligations. We have intensive week here at HST and then spring break. So we're not going to have Hebrew Story Hour for the next 2 weeks. We'll pick up the week after with where we left off in chapter 29. So I'll make announcements on the Facebook page. If you show up and just doesn't open up, then you hopefully will remember this verbal announcement. But thank you all for your participation. I always really enjoy this. Shalom.
Oh.